Hello everyone, today we are going to learn about structure of a cell and the function of a cell. As you can see in the image, this is the structure of a cell. Cell is the basic functional unit of the human body. Definition of the cell which is word derived from the Latin word, it means small room. It is the basic structural, functional and the biological unit of the organisms. So it is the smallest unit of the life. Therefore, cells are often described as building blocks of life. So this cell is the basic structure of the human body, and this cells comes together, it makes a tissue comes together and it makes organ, and it makes system, and system makes the human body. So today we are going to learn about the cell. More about the cell. It has been estimated that humans contains more than or around 40 trillions of cells. So cells were discovered by the Robert Hooke in 1665, and if we talk about the size of the cell, it ranges from minimum 6 μm to resting lymphocytes to a maximum 80 μm. So that is the mature ovum size. So the size of the cells varies from smallest to biggest, 6 μm to 80 μm. Talking about the different types of cells, there are more than or about 200 different types of specialized cells that carry out the multitudes of the function. So this is about the basic information regarding the cell. Now we talk about the structure of a cell. Cell has many minute structure. It includes the cell membrane. This is the wall that covers the cell. It is called as the cell membrane. This is the cell membrane. Then nucleus and the nucleolus. This, the structure which is in the cell, that is known as the nucleus, and this is called as the nucleolus. Then the fluid that is inside the cell, that is known as the cytoplasm, and the small minute organelles, which floats in the cytoplasm, which is known as the cytoplasmic organelles. So basically cell has cell membrane, that is outer layer or the covering. Second is the nucleus or the nucleolus. This is at the center of the cell. Nucleus, it is called as the head of the department or like the functional unit of the cell. Then the cytoplasm, fluid portion of the cell, and the cytoplasmic organelles. These all are the minute structures, organs. They are known as the cytoplasmic organelles. So the first we will see about the cell membrane or the cell wall or the plasma membrane. So every cell in the body which is enclosed by the cell membrane. So all cell, each and every cell which is covered and enclosed by the membrane, it is called as the plasma membrane, it is called as the cell wall, or also it is called as a cell membrane. The cell membrane separates the material outside the cell, that is extracellular, from the inside of the cell, that is intracellular. Suppose this is the cell, this internal environment, that is called as intracellular, and external environment, that is out of the cell, it is called as the extracellular. So this cell membrane separates the intracellular from the extracellular, and it maintains the integrity of cell and controls the passage of material in and out. So this is controlled by the cell membrane. So the cell membrane, this membrane is a double layer of the phospholipid molecules. It is made up of the double lipid of the phospholipid molecules, which we will see in detail. Now this membrane known as the fluid mosaic model, because small molecules comes together, so that's why it is called as the fluid mosaic model. The small molecules of the proteins floats together, and it is called as the fluid mosaic model. Now the protein in the cell membrane, it provides the structural support. this cell membrane also contains a protein. And what's the function of protein of cell membrane? It provides the structural support. It forms the channels for passage of material. For passing of material, these proteins are important. It acts as a receptor site. So certain chemical reactions takes place at these sites, and it also functions as a carrier molecule. So it carries molecule from the inside of the cell to the outside of the cell, or from the outside to the inside, and also provides the identification markers. So you can see in the image, this is the close-up view of the plasma membrane. If we will see in the microscope how the plasma membrane look like. So this is the lipid bilayer. This is the two layers of the lipid. There are the proteins. This are the proteins. Along with this, these are also the proteins, and this has the head and the tail. Along with this membrane, there are the glycolipids, there are the glycoproteins, and there are some cholesterols in the membrane. So plasma membrane is made up of what? So we'll see the composition of plasma membrane. This cell membrane composed of the three substances. Which are they? First is the protein. Most of the part of the plasma membrane is composed of the protein, that is about 55%. Then another composition is the lipids, and the third is the carbohydrate. So plasma membrane mainly made up of the protein, lipids, and the carbohydrates. So we will see the structure of plasma membrane. We saw the composition of plasma membrane. Now we will learn about the structure of plasma membrane. The basic structural framework of the plasma membrane is lipid bilayer. So whenever we say the plasma membrane, we must have that concept that has lipid bilayer. Why it is called lipid bilayer? Because there is back to back two layers of the lipids molecules. So that's why it is called as lipid bilayer. And these lipid molecules like phospholipid, which contains the phosphorus, cholesterol, and the glycolipid, glucose, carbohydrate, which is anchored with the lipid, that is called as the glycolipid. So the plasma membrane, which is lipid bilayer, there is a back to back two layer which is composed of the three kinds of lipids. First is phospholipid, second is the cholesterol, and the third is the glycolipid. So in the image you can see this is lipid bilayer. This is one layer and this is two layer. So back to back two layers, so that is called as lipid bilayer. We talked that it also contains the protein. So there are different proteins. See, this is also protein. This is a kind of protein. So these are the proteins which are in the lipid membrane. Then another is the cholesterol. You can say these are the cholesterol molecules in the plasma membrane. So these are the three things which are present into the lipid membrane. Now talking about the phospholipids, the polar part is the phosphate containing head. This is, we saw, this is the layer. This is lipid bilayer. There are two layers of the lipid, that's why it is called as lipid bilayer. Now this round portion, it is called as the head, and it is a polar part which is hydrophilic. Hydrophilic, that means water favorable, which allows the water molecule. And non-polar part, this is the tail, it is called as the non-polar part, and which is the hydrophobic, that means it is not water favorable. So this lipid bilayer has a polar head which is hydrophilic and the non-polar tail which is hydrophobic. Now another content, that is the cholesterol. Cholesterol in the lipid bilayer, cholesterol molecules are weakly amphipathic, that means it is not much hydrophobic and hydrophilic, and are interspersed among the other lipids in the both layers of the membrane. So you can see in this image, this cholesterol molecules are interspreaded in the lipid bilayer. The carbohydrate groups of the glycolipids forms a polar head and their fatty acids tails are the non-polar, just now we saw. So the glycolipids appears only in the membrane layer that faces the extracellular fluid. So in which membrane layer these glycolipids are present, which faces the extracellular fluid? So you can see in this image, this is the intracellular fluid and there is a extracellular fluid. So these glycolipids are present only on that layer which faces the extracellular fluid. So you can see these are the glycolipids. Now talking about the another composition of the plasma membrane, that is the membrane protein. So the cell membrane has a large content of proteins, typically about 55%, and these proteins are as important because they are responsible for the various biological activity, and the membrane proteins are classified into two, integral or the peripheral protein. So the another major composition of the plasma membrane, it is the protein. The protein, there are the two types of plasma membrane protein. One is the integral protein and the second is the peripheral protein. Now the name itself suggests integral. Integral means it is embedded, firmly embedded, means it is firmly attached with the layer. So this integral protein extends through the lipid bilayer among the fatty acid tails and are firmly embedded in it. So we have seen the layers. This is the head and this is the tail. So this integral proteins are firmly embedded in this entire layer in the head as well as in the tails. So most integral proteins are the transmembrane protein. So why it is transmembrane protein? Because it passes from one membrane to, that is one layer, to the another layer through the tails part as well. So it is called as transmembrane protein, which means they span the entire lipid bilayer. That means it passes from the entire lipid bilayer and protrudes into both the cytosol and the extracellular fluid. So if there is extracellular fluid or the outside of the cell and this is a cytosol, or we can say the intracellular fluid, so there are both the side it is protruded. This kind of protein are protruded both the sides. We'll see in the image, you can say this. This is the example of the integral protein. So it is passes from middle of the layer and protruded outside as well. And this is also an example. It passes into the layer as well as it protrudes outside of the cell as well as it protrudes inside of the cell, that is the cytosol. Second protein is the peripheral protein. Peripheral name itself suggests that is outside. So are not as firmly embedded like integral protein in the membrane. They associate more loosely with the polar heads of a membrane lipids or with the integral proteins at the inner or outer surface of the protein. So that means the peripheral proteins which are not passing through the lipid bilayer, it is associated peripherally on the surface of the lipid layer. Many membrane proteins are the glycoproteins. This membrane has another protein as well, that is known as the glycoprotein, and proteins with this carbohydrate glyco, the name itself suggests glyco related to carbohydrate group, the carbohydrate group which is attached with the protein. So these proteins with the carbohydrate groups attached to the ends that protrudes into the extracellular fluid. So you can see in this image, this is the glycoprotein. See, this is the glycoprotein. Where it is attached? It is attached on the protein which is protruded extracellularly. So it is attached to this protein. So basically we saw two types of protein, integral protein and the peripheral protein. These are an examples of the integral protein, right? That is also known as the transmembrane protein. And the second protein is the peripheral protein. This are the peripheral protein, and this one is the glycoprotein, carbohydrate group which is attached with the protein, that is known as the glycoprotein. So this was about the proteins which are involved in the lipid bilayer. Now the functions of the membrane protein. What are the functions of the membrane protein? The first protein function is the glycoprotein and the glycolipids. It serves as a cell identity marker. That means it identifies as a self and the non-self cell. It differentiates between the self cell and the non-self cell. Now second is the acts as a receptors. So receptor, it acts as a recognition site, certain specific recognition sites for hormones and other chemical messengers. So the some chemicals and hormones takes place or the interchange at the certain particular site. So that's why it is called as the acts as a receptor. Another is the some integral proteins are the enzymes that catalyze specific chemical reactions. So the some proteins which are enzymes, so as enzymes it catalyzes some chemical reaction. That means it provokes or it fastens certain chemical reactions. Then certain transmembrane proteins which forms the channels. We know the meaning of channels through which we pass, right, or the substance can pass. So this transmembrane protein forms the channel that are filled with the water and allow very small water soluble ions to cross through the membrane. Suppose this is a transmembrane protein, it has a groove inside it. So this is channel which is filled with the water and some water soluble molecules can pass through this. So that is the another function of the transmembrane protein. And some are involved in the pumps that transport substances across the membrane. So the some protein works as a pump, and this pumps transports substances across the membrane from intracellular to extracellular, from extracellular to intracellular. Then integral protein, they may also work as a linkers which anchors the proteins in the plasma membranes of the neighboring cells to one another. So the one another cells that this kind of protein works as a linker, so they attach with the another cells. So these are the functions of the plasma membrane proteins. Now we saw the plasma membrane is made up of what, which are the composition and what are the structure. Now we will see the functions of the cell membrane. So which are the functions? As we know, it is layer, it is a covering. So the first function is always the protective function. So the cell membrane protects the cytoplasm and the organelles present into the cytoplasm. So you know this is a cell, and this cell membrane protects the small cell organelles as well the cytoplasm from the extracellular environment. The second is the selective permeability. Now the cell membrane acts as a semi-permeable membrane. Semi-permeable means it allows only few molecules to come inside the cell and go out of the cell. Only some substances to pass through it and act as a barrier for other substances which are harmful to the cells. So this selective permeability will prevent the entering of certain harmful substances. It allows only few substances to enter the cell and to go out of the cell. Now the absorptive function, another function of the cell membrane is the absorptive function. The nutrients are absorbed into the cell through the cell membrane. So the cell requires nutrients and which is transported through the cell membrane. Another functions includes excretory function. So metabolites and other wastes which are produced in the cells are excreted through the cell membrane. Again, those substances are not useful, which are harmful or which is waste products, they are excreted through the plasma membrane only. Now another is the exchange of gases. As we know, the oxygen enters the cell from the blood and the carbon dioxide leaves the cell and enters the blood through the cell membrane only. So this gas exchange takes place through the cell membrane. Then maintenance of shape and the size of the cell. So this cell membrane is responsible for the maintenance of the shape and the size of the cell. So it prevents distortions in the cell shape and the size. So this was all about the functions of the plasma membrane. Now another important function that we learned, that transportation of certain substances from inside to outside of the cell and from outside to inside of the cell. So today now we are going to learn about the transport across the cell membrane, which is very important. So the transport of the material across the plasma membrane is essential to life of a cell. So why it is important? For transportation is important because some important molecules can come inside the cell like nutrients, oxygen and some waste products need to excrete from the cell, and which is done by the transport only. So the certain substances must move into the cell and it supports the metabolic reactions. Now other substances that have been produced by the cell for export or as a cellular waste products must move out of the cell. So there should be transport across the cell membrane. So basically there are the two types of the transport. First is the passive transport, or we can say the passive process, and the second is the active process. Now the name itself suggests a passive transport which don't require energy or which don't require breakdown of the ATP. So the passive process, a substance move down its concentration or the electric gradient to cross the membrane using only its own kinetic energy. That is, what is kinetic energy? It is the energy of a motion. So the movement of cells, movement of molecules which produce the energy, that is called as the kinetic energy. So the kinetic energy is intrinsic to the particles and they are, that are moving, and there is no input of energy from the cells. So the substances or the molecules which are moving, they produces the energy, and with that energy they can cross or they can move, and there is no another support or the energy need to given by the cell. So the example of the passive transport, it is the simple diffusion. Now the second transport is the active process or the active transport. So the cellular energy is used to drive the substances. That means to move the substances from inside to outside or from outside to inside, these molecules need energy or the cellular energy, and the substance uphill against its concentration or electric gradients. So this substance which moves against the concentration gradients means lower concentration to higher concentration, and it requires energy by the breakdown of ATP, and as well as it needs the carrier protein which helps in transporting the molecules. So basically there are the two types of the transport. First is the passive transport and second is the active transport. So in the image you can see this is active transport and this is the passive transport. Directly the molecules can pass through the lipid bilayer and it moves. So that is diffusion. Or with the channels which are filled with the water soluble molecules can move, and with the protein carriers the molecules can move. So this is the passive transport. And active transport, movement of molecules require the and ATP, that we will see in detail. So the first is the passive transport, the transport of the substances along with the concentration gradient or the electrical gradient or both electrochemical gradient is called passive transport. So here substance moves along to the concentration gradient, means higher concentration to low concentration. Here the substances move from the region of higher concentration to region of lower concentration, and it is also known as diffusion or the downhill movement. So the molecules moves from the higher concentration to lower concentration. It is known as the diffusion, or it is also called as the downhill movement. Now in this transportation we don't need, or the molecules don't need the energy. Diffusion or the passive transport, which is divided into two types. The first is the simple diffusion and the second is the facilitated diffusion. There are the two types, simple diffusion and the facilitated diffusion. So the first we will see the simple diffusion. The simple diffusion can occur through the lipid layer, where lipid soluble substances such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, alcohol are transported through the lipid layer of the cell membrane. So this is the molecules which can transport through the lipid bilayer. So that is simple diffusion. Now the simple diffusion can also occur through the protein layer, whereby water soluble substances such as electrolytes are transported with the help of protein channels present in the cell membrane. So simply this is the membrane, this is molecules is transporting from here to here. So through the lipid bilayer, so that is called as diffusion, simple diffusion. Other thing that this is a protein channel, this is the channel here to here, it is transporting here. So that is again an example of the simple diffusion. So you can see in the image, this is the extracellular fluid and this is the cytoplasm, that is from the, this is inside of the cells. So these molecules are transporting via this lipid by layer. So you can say this, the molecules are transported here, and primarily all the molecules were outside of the cell, then 3 molecules came and gradually all molecules will enter inside the cell. So this is an example of the simple diffusion. Now we will see the facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion, so in this type of diffusion, some carrier proteins helps the transport of the substances. So here the carrier proteins are used to transport the substances, carrier proteins, right? The water soluble substances with the large molecules cannot pass through the protein channels by the simple diffusion. Here we saw in the simple diffusion, these molecules can directly come inside with the lipid bilayer, or the molecules can come which are water soluble can come through the protein channel, but which are very small in size. But the water soluble molecules which are large in size, they needs a carrier protein, and that's why it is called as the facilitated diffusion. So what happens here, the water soluble substances with the larger molecules cannot pass through the protein channels by the simple diffusion, right? That we know what is simple diffusion, and the substances are transported with the help of carrier protein. So in that case, the large molecule needs the help of the carrier protein. So this type of diffusion is faster than the simple diffusion. So here there is a use of carrier protein, so this diffusion is the faster than the simple diffusion, and glucose and amino acids are transported by this method, as glucose and amino acids molecules are large enough, so that's why they need the carrier protein. So you can see in the image, so this directly they can come like this, with the channel they can come like this, or with the larger molecules, they need a carrier protein. So the carrier protein will take these molecules, then they will leave this molecule into the opposite direction. Okay. So this was about the facilitated diffusion and the simple diffusion. Both are an example of passive transport. Now we'll talk about the osmosis. Osmosis is a special type of diffusion, and it is the spontaneous net movement of the solvent molecules. Here you need to focus, there is a solvent molecules movement takes place through the selective permeable membrane into a region of higher solute concentration. So in the direction that tends to equalize the solute concentration. So here there is a movement of solvent from where to where. One side you can see in this image, there is a few molecules of the solutes here, and there are the many molecules of the solutes. So what will happen, this is the liquid portion, it is called as the solvent. This solvent will move this side and it will equalize the concentration of the solutes to the both sides. So you can see in the second image, the concentration of the solutes, now it is equal. Why it become equal? Because the fluid portion or the solvent which is shifted through the semi-permeable membrane to where there is a lower concentration of the solvent and a higher concentration of the solutes, and then it equalizes the concentration of the solutes, and this is called as the osmosis, and it is a special type of the diffusion. So this is all about the passive transport. Now moving on to the second type of transport which takes place through the plasma membrane. So that is active transport. So active transport is the movement of molecules across the cell membrane from a region of lower concentration to a region of a higher concentration against the concentration gradient. In diffusion, transport occurs from higher concentration to lower concentration. So the kinetic energy is produced by the movement of the cell through which the molecules can move across. But in active transport, movements takes place from lower concentration to higher concentration. That means against the concentration gradients. So that's why it requires energy. So in active transport require cellular energy to achieve this movement. So you can see these molecules transporting, which are lower concentration over here and there is a higher concentration. So transporting from this to this, it requires energy. Now there are the two types of the active transport. The first is the primary active transport that uses adenosine triphosphate, that is ATP, and secondary active transport that uses an electrochemical gradient. So active transport again divided into two. First is the primary active transport and second is the secondary active transport. Both the transport uses energy in a different way. The primary active transport uses ATP, whereas secondary active transport uses electrochemical gradient. So an example of the active transport in human physiology is uptake of glucose in the intestine. We will see more in detail. So first, primary active transport. The primary active transport, also called as the direct active transport. It is also called as the direct active transport. So directly uses chemical energy. It uses the chemical energy such as adenosine triphosphate or ATP in case of the cell membrane to transport all species of solutes across the membrane against that concentration gradient. So simply the primary active transport, what it does? It uses ATP to transport the molecules from lower concentration to higher concentration. Okay, so you can see this in the image, it is using the ATP. Another is the secondary active transport. Though in secondary active transport, the movement of sodium ions down the gradient is coupled to the uphill transport of other substance, okay, by a shared carrier protein, or it is called as a co-transporter. So here two molecules are moved together. Say for example, you can see in the image the concentration of sodium. Here you can see the sodium concentration is higher outside the cell and the sodium concentration is lower inside the cell. So this sodium molecule will coupled with the glucose molecule. Glucose molecule is lower concentration outside the cell and inside the cell glucose concentration is higher. So what happens over here? This sodium will engage with the glucose molecules with the help of carrier protein. The sodium molecule will move down the concentration and the glucose molecule will move against the concentration gradient. So with this, sodium will carry this molecule inside the cell. So this is an example of the secondary active transport. So what happens in secondary active transport? One molecule has a higher concentration outside the cell and another molecule has lower concentration outside the cell. The molecule which has a higher concentration will combine with the molecule which has a lower concentration, and using the electrochemical gradient it transports via the protein, carrier protein, and it leaves the molecule which is high concentration inside and moves the sodium from higher to lower. So this is how the secondary transportation takes place. In secondary active transport, the two molecules being transported, just as I said, may move either in the same direction. That means both the things will come inside the cell, or in the opposite direction. That means one will come inside the cell and one will out of the cell. So you can see over here, this sodium molecule will go outside of the cell and this potassium molecule will come inside of the cell, and this is called as an antiporter. That means one molecule comes inside, one molecule come outside. So that is called as antiporter. So when they move in the same direction, the protein that transports them, it is called as a symporter. While if they move opposite directions, so then the protein called as an antiporter. So you can see this. So this is the protein via which two molecules, say for example this is Na plus and the glucose molecule, they come inside the cell. So this protein is called as a symporter protein. Now this is the K plus and this is Na plus. So the K plus come inside the cells and the Na plus goes outside the cell, and this protein is known as the antiporter. So this was all about the active transport. As active transport are the two types, primary active transport and the secondary active transport. Primary active transport uses the ATP and secondary active transport uses the electrochemical gradients, and that moves the molecules. Now another transport that takes place across the cell membrane, that is the bulk transport. Now the bulk, that means the many molecules at a time. So the bulk transport are like endocytosis. Endo means inside and cytosis means the cell. So inside the cell And exocytosis, exo means outside of the cell and cytosis means the process through which the molecules comes inside inside of the cell. So there are bulk transport, endocytosis and the exocytosis are both the forms of the bulk transport, and that moves the material into and out of the cells respectively via the vesicles. These are small vesicles which carries the substances and which expels out of the cell and brings inside the cell. So in the case of endocytosis, cellular membrane folds around the desired substance which is outside of the cell. Suppose this is the cell, this is the cell membrane. Okay, there are some substance which we need to bring inside. So what will happen? There is a formation of the fold, this kind of folds, and gradually it will fold like this and it will become vesicle and it will come inside the cell. So that kind of thing, that is cellular membrane folds. The ingested particles becomes trapped within a pouch known as the vesicle. So these particles get trapped, okay, and this is known as the vesicle. This is known as the vesicle. Inside the cytoplasm, often the enzymes from lysosomes are then used to digest the molecules absorbed by this process. So the molecules which comes inside, which get absorbed and digested by the lysosomes. So this is the bulk transport, endocytosis and the exocytosis. So the substances that enter the cell via the signal mediated electrolysis includes the proteins, hormones and the growth and the stabilization factors. So these substances can enter via the signal mediated electrolysis and that comes inside the cell by the endocytosis process. Then viruses that enters through a form of endocytosis that involves their outer membrane fusing with the membrane of the cell, and this forces viral DNA into the host cell. So as we know, whenever the person get infected, the virus enters into the cell membrane. So that how it enters, the cell membrane of the virus and the cell membrane of the cell get fused, and then the DNA of the virus will enter into the membrane cell. So here in the picture you can see there are different examples of the endocytosis. First is the phagocytosis. This is phagocytosis. So in the phagocytosis you can see these are the solid particles and this is the plasma membrane. This plasma membrane will create a fold around a solid particle and then it will make a vesicle and it will trap the molecule. Then the pinocytosis, from the extracellular fluid, these molecules again it will cause the fold and then it will become a vesicle and it will come into the cytoplasm. Another is the receptor mediated endocytosis. The cell membrane has a certain receptor, as we talked, the proteins work as some receptors. So these receptors get attached with the specialized molecules only and then they get attached and then it will form a vesicle. So this is an example of the endocytosis. And this is the bacteria which has attacked on the human cells or the body. So this bacteria will be vesicalized and it will enter into the cell. Then what will happen? This is by the phagocytosis, and then the phagosomes and the lysosomes, it will get merged, it will digest, and phagolysosomes. So this bacteria will get digested by the lysosomes, and this waste material, the waste products or the waste molecules are excreted or through the exocytosis. So this is an example of the exocytosis. So that is bulk transport. Bulk transport got the two types, endocytosis and the exocytosis. So this was all about the cell membrane. Cell membrane, it is one of the important structure of the cell membrane which covers the cell. So it separates the cell from extracellular environment to the intracellular environment. Cell membrane is also known as the plasma membrane or the cell wall. This plasma membrane is composed of cholesterol, protein and the lipid. This lipid are forming the lipid bilayer, back to back two layers, head and tail part. In this lipids there are some membrane proteins, integral proteins or the glycoproteins, which these proteins acts as a receptor site, acts as a identity markers, it acts as a transport channels, and these membranes are made up of most of the protein. This plasma membrane, as we know, that it is composed of protein, lipid and cholesterol, and it has layers, and this layers has a specific function, protects the cell environment from the extracellular. Even it helps in the transportation of the material from inside to outside of the cell. And this cell membrane specifically, it also maintains the shape and the size of the cell, and this membrane prevents the entering of unknown substances. It only allows the certain substances. So it is called as the semi-permeable membrane. And the most important function of the plasma membrane is the transport. We saw there are different transport. First is the passive transport and the active transport. Passive transport, again it has two types of passive transport, diffusion and the facilitated diffusion, and the other type is the osmosis, which is special type of diffusion. So diffusion, in that higher concentration to lower concentration. In the facilitated diffusion, the larger size of molecules are moved with the protein carrier, and that is higher concentration to lower. So that is known as the passive diffusion. Another is the osmosis. In the osmosis, movement of the solvent, lower concentration of solvent to the movement of the solvents from the lower concentration of the solutes to higher concentration of the solutes. And then we saw the active transport. Active transport again divided into two, primary active transport and the secondary active transport. Primary active transport is using the ATP while transporting from lower concentration to higher concentration, whereas secondary active transport using the electrochemical gradient from lower concentration to higher concentration. So this was all about the cell membrane and the functions of the cell membrane. Thank you.